Shut the Blinds by Rainbow Blunderbolt. Chapter 2. Little Talks. Twilight sighed as she watched the clock on the wall in the waiting room of the Ponyville Hospital. It had been about 20 minutes since she and her friend had been herded out of Rainbow Dash's room. After being told she was blind, the Pegasus had been silent for a while, but then had reacted rather violently. Even now she could still hear the screams that came from the now blinded Pegasus. Screams of how her life was ruined, and how she could never join in the Wonderbolts, echoed through her very soul. At that point, Twilight thought Rainbow Dash would personally maim the doctor that had told her the unfortunate news herself. But thankfully, with the help of Applejack herself and a few nurses, they were able to get her calmed down enough to a point where her agonised cries died down into small whimpers. Poor Rainbow Dash, Twilight thought as she let the events that had transpired play over in her head. As she looked around the room, the looks on her friends' faces suggested that they all seemed to be thinking the same thing. Personally, the unicorn couldn't imagine what Rainbow Dash was going through, though she certainly had a pretty good idea. She still didn't want to even think about it. Not being able to fly would be hard for any Pegasus, but for Rainbow Dash, it would be more or less crippling for her. Her whole life basically revolved around the sport, not to mention it was her special talent. And if you didn't have that, what did you have? Her mind started to wonder what it would be like to live without her horn, unable to perform magic, her own special talent. She shuddered in horror. Her whole productive world would come to a crashing halt. Shaking her head, she busied herself with looking at the clock's slow-moving hands once again. "Do you think Dashie will be all right?" Pinkie Pie asked. Twilight saw her kicking her back legs against the chair she was currently seated in. "Are you hearing yourself?" Applejack said incredulously, trying to bring some light-hearted humour to the dreary scene. "This is Rainbow Dash we're talking about, the most awesomest pony in Equestria. That pony's walked away just fine from all sorts of tight spots. She'll be okay." Applejack was scanning the room with a blank look on her face. There was something in the Earth Pony's voice that made Twilight unsure just who she was trying to convince. "I don't know," Pinkie said uncertainly. "She seemed pretty upset." "Pretty upset? Pretty upset is an understatement. Even with the bandages over her eyes, she was pretty dead on her hooves," Rarity said, leaning her head back in her chair as she talked. "I'm sorry, Applejack, dear, but I'm going to have to agree with Pinkie on this situation. Oh, you can't imagine how the poor darling is feeling. What do you think, Twilight?" Twilight didn't answer at first. She'd been caught up in her own thoughts to catch any of the details that had flown in one ear and out the other. "Twilight?" Rarity said once again. "Huh?" She blinked, looking up quickly. Rarity snorted. "I said, what do you think about Rainbow Dash?" "Oh, She couldn't think of what to say for a while. A better way to describe it was she couldn't find a way to put what she was thinking into words. "Well, I think that it's going to take quite a while to get used to it, for us and for her," Twilight said, returning her attention to the clock. Deep sighs were exchanged as the room fell silent once again. Time marched on slowly and quietly. Twilight noted it seemed as though they'd spent hours and hours on end waiting for any news concerning their friend. But it had only been half an hour. Still, no matter what time it was, nothing about their friend had presented itself to them, much to the Lavender Unicorn's annoyance. Finally, after getting bored with looking at the clock, she looked around the room, suddenly interested in what her friends were doing. Pinkie Pie's hooves were tapping against the ground, and the Earth Pony had a thoughtful look on her face. Rarity had pulled out a hoof file out from somewhere. Then again, Twilight figured, the fashionista was never without one anyway, and was using her magic to work on her front left hoof. Applejack had her Stetson over her eyes, and was slouched back in her chair, most likely sleeping. It was then that Twilight realised just how tired she really was. Just as she was about to shut her eyes, the sound of the double doors opening and hoofsteps trotting towards them stopped her intent of catching a few winks. Muttering something unintelligible under her breath, she nudged Applejack, who sat beside her. "What's it?" Applejack sputtered, flailing her front hoofs in all which ways, and scrambling to sit up. Her frantically turning head stopped when she saw Nurse Redheart coming towards them. Her mouth formed to an O shape, and she calmly placed her hat back squarely on her head and sat up in her chair. The two others had been alerted by Applejack and had seen the nurse coming up to them. They sat up a little straighter. Twilight guessed they were just as eager as she was to hear any news about their blind friend. "Well, it took a while," Nurse Redheart started as she stood in front of her 4 ponies. But we managed to calm her down and run some final tests." "Tests?" Twilight echoed, concerned by what the nurse meant. "Just some final concerns about her sight and her overall health," Redheart assured. "She's very lucky, you know." "We know," Applejack smiled. Is Dashy going to be okay?" Pinky asked, some of the usual poofiness in her mane inflating with hopefulness. "Yes, she's going to be just fine." They all breathed out in a large sigh of relief. "Visiting hours are over, and right now she's getting some rest. It's my personal opinion that you all go home and do the same," Redheart offered kindly. "Right, thank you so much," Rarity said gratefully. "Any time," Nurse Redheart replied as she turned away and once again left the waiting room to the 4 friends. As soon as she was gone, Twilight turned and made her way out the hospital. A cool blast of air hit her face as she opened the doors with her magic. It was refreshing, to say the least, as she breathed in the chilly air. After being in hospital for what seemed like forever, the welcoming sight of Ponyville made her smile. The sun was just up in the sky, meaning that it was probably still fairly early in the morning. Perfect. She lifted her hoofs and started to walk, but that was cut short when a voice called out to her. "Twilight!" She turned around to see Applejack running towards her, followed closely behind by Rarity and Pinkie Pie. "Where are you going?" the farm pony asked. "Fluttershy's. I need to speak with her," she answered quickly. "Maybe that's not such a good idea. You know how close she and Dashy are," Pinkie said hesitantly. I know. It's just, she's going to have to find out sooner or later. And if you ask me, it's probably better for all of us, her included, if she finds out sooner," Twilight countered, facing the pink pony. Pinkie Pie considered this for a few moments. After the look of consideration had passed, it was replaced by a look of compassionate acceptance. "You're right, Twilight. I mean, if one of my best friends got blinded by some meanie-pants dragon trying to protect me, I'd want to know right away if they were okay," Pinkie said in her usual attitude, returning to her. Pinkie Pie? Isn't Rainbow Dash already one of your friends?" Applejack asked, raising an eyebrow. "Duh! If she wasn't, why would I be here?" Pinkie exclaimed. Applejack let out an expirated sigh and turned back to Twilight. "Just go easy on her, okay? You know how she is. Don't worry, it'll be fine." "Can one of you come and find me when we can see Rainbow Dash again?" Twilight asked, starting to walk in the direction of Fluttershy's cottage. "Of course," Rarity answered immediately. Her eyes then widened. "Oh dear, I almost forgot. My parents are bringing Sweetabelle over for the weekend. Oh, I have to go." The white unicorn briskly trotted away, looking back at the little group. "Goodbye, I'll call you later, Twilight." With that, she was gone. Pinkie started walking away as well. "Bye, guys. I have to help the Cakes take care of the twins. They have a huge order to take care of, and... Oh, Applejack, I need you too." "What the buck?" The farm pony was cut off by her fellow earth pony, grabbing her hat off her head and running with it. "Pinkie, get back here!" "Ugh, see you later, Twi," Applejack said in a hurry as she started bucking it down the road after Pinkie Pie. Twilight watched them leave, an amused glint in her eye as she heard cries of "Give my hat back!" echoed in the distance. After the departure of her friends, she made her own exit. She wasn't quite looking forward to her little trip, but it was something she felt had to be done. And Twilight, being the proactive mare that she was determined to do just that. She'd only hoped the shy mare was going to see would be willing to cooperate with her. The walk to the small cottage was pleasant enough. Celestia's sun was shining brightly in the sky, and the leaves on the trees whistled as a soft spring breeze blew through them. She heard birds chirp happily in the distance, and only wished she could be as happy as they seemed to be at that moment. Life just wasn't like that, she reminded herself sadly. Still, even with that depressing bit of reality, she managed to keep her focus on the scenery around her. Her pessimistic nature marched on, however. It seemed that no matter how hard she tried to keep it all at a tolerable minimum, it still managed to invade her subconscious. Soon enough, Twilight found herself face to face with Fluttershy's humble abode. She took a deep breath and headed to the front door. With only a moment's hesitation, she reached out a hoof and knocked on the moderately sized wooden door. And she heard an eep, followed by some small rustles. Who is it?" the timid voice asked. "It's Twilight," she asked in a deadpan tone. A gasp was then heard. Fluttershy's not home right now. Please leave a message after the beep," the voice said quickly, barely hovering above a whisper. If that's not too much trouble for you, that is," was quickly added on. "Come on, Fluttershy, I know you're in there," she said, tapping her hoof lightly against the soil, and she spoke up again. "It's about Rainbow Dash. She woke up today. Can I..." After a few tense moments passed between them, the door was opened a crack, and Twilight saw a seeing eye look out at her. "Can I come in, please?" Twilight pleaded softly. The eye blinked sadly before the door, to Twilight's relief, was opened fully, revealing a yellow mare with a bubblegum pink mane, otherwise known as Fluttershy, or just the pony she wanted to see. Fluttershy moved to the side and nodded her head to the inside of the cottage, and Twilight returned the nod gratefully and stepped inside the welcoming house. She'd been inside the place a few times before and had figured out she liked it more than her other friends' houses. Their houses were always too busy, or she barely visited them. Fluttershy's house was always quiet, free from almost any noise of the small town just beside them, and only held the welcoming sound of nature that would chime in through the cottage. A bird hopped onto her back as soon as she stepped in, and she chuckled as she shook it off. Her eyes and Fluttershy's met for longer than intended, and things began to slowly succumb to awkwardness. Twilight averted her gaze quickly and kept walking further into the house, not looking back at her Pegasus friend to avoid uncomfortable looks. They walked through the humble home until they came to a relatively large room that had an airy feel to it, and the contents of that room was a couch and a few chairs scattered about in what looked like no distinct order or pattern as far as she could tell. Twilight looked back to see Fluttershy gesturing towards a comfy-looking chair next to the couch. She took the hint, walked over quickly, and sitting down, Fluttershy followed suit, making her way to the couch and delicately placing herself on it, one of its lush cushions, drawing her hooves in underneath her. The awkward silence from earlier had firmly settled itself into the room, and neither of the two ponies dared to break it. Twilight thought desperately for a way to start the inevitable conversation, but so far her mind had turned in a blank. "Come on, Twilight. You just have to start it. You can do this," she encouraged herself inwardly. When she decided that she was ready enough, she opened her mouth hesitantly, struggling to get the words that were waiting to be said past a lump in her throat. "So," she started. "So?" Fluttershy repeated quietly. "Look, I know you don't want to talk about..." No, it's okay. So you said she woke up today?" Fluttershy asked, finally looking up at the unicorn. "Oh, yes she did," Twilight replied. "It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was most definitely a start." How was it?" Fluttershy seemed to become more inverted as each word slipped out of her mouth. It was all right. At first. Twilight sighed, the floor becoming very interesting all of a sudden. "At first?" Fluttershy's voice took a sudden jump into concern as she listened to Twilight's retelling of the series of unfortunate events that had transpired not too long ago. "Oh, she's fine. She just kind of... Oh, what's the word?" Twilight mumbled, tapping her hoof to her mouth in thought. "Exploded?" Fluttershy suggested. "Yeah, that's it." The unicorn smiled, nodding in approval. Fluttershy sighed and looked down in what appeared to be shame. Oh, I wish I could have just been there," she said quietly. "And that's the point." "Why weren't you there? She needed you. You're her best friend," Twilight exclaimed, beginning to stand. But it was Fluttershy's next statement that kept her in her seat. "Because I was scared," Fluttershy cried, a sudden ferocity welling up in her eyes. She snapped her head up and looked at Twilight straight in the eye. Twilight swallowed and waiting for Fluttershy to continue. You didn't see what happened. You weren't there when the dragon came, when he tried to kill us. Twilight, she stepped in front of the fire for me, and she became blind for me. It's all my fault. And now she hates me, and it's all my fault, the yellow Pegasus screamed. At some point during her outburst, the Pegasus started sobbing. It was only now that Twilight noticed this, and she quickly pulled her friend into a tight hug, letting Fluttershy cry her eyes out on her shoulder. Mumbles of, "I'm sorry," and "It's all my fault," came from Fluttershy, mixing with her weary sobs that sputtered from her every few seconds. Seeing her like this made Twilight's heart ache with sympathy. She wished she could do more, but right now the comforting hug was all she could offer the Pegasus. They stayed like that for a few minutes, Fluttershy crying and Twilight holding her gently, occasionally rubbing her back in an effort to soothe her. Fluttershy's pet bunny Angel had hopped in on them, but with the state Fluttershy was in and a stern look from Twilight, he had quickly and quietly left the room. "It's okay, Fluttershy. It's okay. Rainbow Dash is okay," Twilight soothed. "But she's not, is she?" was all she got in response. Twilight couldn't think of anything to say. "Why couldn't it have been me? She doesn't deserve this," Fluttershy whispered. The unicorn's expressions hardened. She pulled Fluttershy off the shoulder and held the Pegasus in front of her, ignoring the shocked look on Fluttershy's face. "Fluttershy, don't you dare think that. Rainbow made the decision to save you herself, and I think she knew the consequences of her actions when she did it. Imagine how she would feel if she heard that. I know for a fact that she wouldn't want you to cry over her, and I know she doesn't blame you for this," Twilight told her. For a minute she thought she might have said too much, and Fluttershy's already teary eyes started to well up again, but that quickly disappeared when the shy Pegasus gave her a weak smile. "You're right, Twilight," Fluttershy said reassuringly, perking up. "I'm sorry. I got so emotional back there." "It's okay, Fluttershy," Twilight answered, giving her a smile. "Hey, would you like to see Rainbow Dash? I'm sure—" No, that's fine. I have to take care of my animal friends, and they usually keeps me very busy," Fluttershy said quickly, stepping up from the couch, and Twilight did the same. "Oh, okay. I guess I'll just be going now. I wouldn't want to keep you from your work after all," the unicorn said, turning in the direction of the door and walking to it. Fluttershy followed a few steps behind her, and Twilight took note of the Pegasus's quick, almost nervous steps as they walked. Seemed like that once they'd reached the door, Fluttershy was almost relieved. "I'm so glad we had this talk, Fluttershy," Twilight said, just standing outside the entrance of the cottage. Yes, I'm glad too," Fluttershy answered, her eyes flickering nervously towards the inside of the house. I guess I'll just be going now. I'll tell Rainbow Dash you said hi." "Bye," she said, turning, walking away. Twilight heard a quiet farewell from what she guessed was the Pegasus, and her mouth curled in a small, satisfied smile. What she wasn't aware of was that once she was out of earshot, small sobs echoed from the direction of the small cottage on the edge of the ever-free forest.